So good morning. The second track we have is a fireside chat with Nicola and Christian. I have had an opportunity to work with both of them, and they are very, very clear about their purpose in life, which is to have a huge, big impact on our planet and on our future generations. So, welcoming Nicola and Christian for the fireside chat.
Hello, Nicola. All right, so you lead the climate work at VMware, where Vipul leads the procurement work. The first thing that I think most companies prioritizing climate work find is that the carbon emissions are 80-90% in the supply chain, which poses a huge challenge, of course, because the carbon emissions from on-site energy use are one thing, but the data problems to even understand the carbon in the supply chain, nonetheless then to act on it, reduce it, is very intimidating. So now VMware is a leader on this work. You're a CDP Climate A company. You're on the 2022 Supplier Engagement Leaderboard. You've worked with the Science Based Targets Initiative to set really ambitious carbon reduction goals for 2030. So we'll talk about the how of all that, but I thought I'd open us with the why. Like, why is VMware prioritizing such a complex set of projects?
Great, thank you, Christian. And hello, everybody. It's great to be with you on this lovely Friday morning. And to get us started, I think the very first thing I want to say is that sustainability is not a thing that's on the side of the business anymore. It is a business strategy, and for many of the reasons our previous speakers touched on, it is becoming more so. So for us at VMware, sustainability is baked into our core business strategy, and that's really driven, Christian, by two things. Number one is resilience, and number two is innovation. So what's behind that? The why behind that? Well, very pragmatically, today, as I said, it's becoming table stakes. Sustainability is increasingly a component of our bookings. Our customers are asking us, when they contract with us in RFPs, what are we doing? Number one, how can we help them with low carbon solutions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's number one. It's a part of doing business today, no matter what sector you're in. Number two is that sustainability is increasingly a component of our trusted relationships with our customers and our suppliers. So that's the business reason, right? I think we'll probably touch on regulation. There are a number of drivers from regulation to employee expectations. But let's not forget, everybody, our businesses do not exist in a silo. We are all connected, and I couldn't think of a better organization or a better group of people who understand how deeply interconnected our businesses are than you all who work in supply chain. Because we are customers of each other, we all are dependent on resources, inputs, etc. for our businesses. But the one thing that we all have in common is our businesses exist on this planet. And this little blue marble hurtling through time and space is it, everybody. And there are planetary boundaries within which we need to, if we want to continue our businesses, we need to understand. We need to understand those planetary boundaries within which our businesses, if we want them to endure, are going to need to adapt to, because we've blown our carbon budget. We've put more stuff in the atmosphere than the Earth can absorb. That's the reality. And I often get asked, well, you're a software company, you make ones and zeros. Like, really? Well, actually, we're in everyone's supply chain. So yes, really, it's important.
I love it. You talk about these two reasons, the kind of business imperative on the one hand, and then the urgency for all of us to combat this long-term threat to the business. When and how did VMware first decide to prioritize this work? Like, what were those early conversations?
Yeah, so, to be honest, it's been a journey. And VMware is a company that has had sustainability in its DNA from the very beginning. Hands up, folks who are familiar with what VMware does. Oh, excellent. Okay, I'm at a tech conference. Everybody knows what VMware does. All right, so you will appreciate that virtualization, right, our core bread and butter. Today, VMware is obviously a much more complex business, and we're focused on multi-cloud and enabling much of what our previous speakers discussed. That's to say, virtualization has had a massive impact in efficiency of the data center. So we started with that. We're very fortunate in that our founders and our leadership understood that from the beginning. But we've been on a journey, right? And our journey is very similar to, I think, other companies, where you start with being responsible, recycling your yogurt cups in the break room, right? Then moving on to green buildings, doing all sorts, for us it was green buildings, then it was about procuring renewable energy, being carbon neutral, RE100. And now we're at a pivot point of net zero. And that is our commitment to align with what I discussed, those planetary boundaries, the Paris Agreement, and the science that informs those boundaries, to do our part to keep our growth of the company within that 1.5 degrees of warming. So everything that we can do to make sure our business does what we can. So yes, it's been a journey, Christian. We didn't get there overnight, but the most important thing about that journey is the pivot we made in 2020. And that pivot was from sustainability being something that my team drove, and with lots of cajoling and favors from others in the business, to sustainability being a business priority and integrating the goals that we have, our 2030 goals, and there's 30 of them, to the business. So Vipul holds one of those goals. So it's not me, Nicola, and the sustainability team that is responsible for achieving our supply chain net zero goal. It's Vipul, right? And secondly, that is now tied to our objectives and key results. That then goes up to our board of directors, and it's tied to executive compensation. So we are serious about it, and the big change is that integration with the business to drive outcomes.
I'm intrigued that 2020 was the pivot point. So Watershed works with a lot of large companies on their climate work, and we've seen something similar, that the past few years have been a huge inflection point in the volume and seriousness of climate work that large companies are doing. Why 2020? Like, what clicked in that year?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think so much of it, our previous speakers touched on it. We've been doing this work for a while. We actually were in the process of doing what's called a materiality assessment. So that's a piece of strategy work to look at what's most important to VMware on our sustainability. And like everyone, the pandemic took us all by surprise and changed everything. And in that year, maybe some of you who are local, you'll remember the day the sky turned orange, right? The massive wildfires and the impact that had on us, even down here on the peninsula. There was that. There was George Floyd. Then we started the supply chain crisis, and it has just escalated from there. So I think there was a combination of macro forces that have been emerging over time that crescendoed together around the pandemic, and the urgency accelerated. So we started to see, and surprising, you'd think that sustainability would fall off the map in the pandemic during time of crisis, but it hasn't, and it has only increased because of those multiple macro forces at play, not the least of which is regulation. right? And the regulators around the world have stepped up to the plate, recognizing that we need a level playing field, right? In business, we need a level playing. This voluntary approach, creates uncertainty, but creates an uneven playing field for us to operate in. So lots of things together is the answer for 2020.
So curious, as you focus on this net zero goal, what are the big challenges, and maybe for supply chain in particular, because the net zero goal seems to really take us there. Like, you've been in RE100 since I think 2019, which means a huge focus on renewable energy for the business's own activities. But I guess as we look ahead to this supply chain goal or to this net zero goal for 2030, that presumably becomes a lot about the supply chain. So what's the role of supply chain, and how are you thinking about approaching it?
Great. Okay, let me just do a quick check of something important. Folks in the room have heard of Scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? A couple of hands. Okay, so I'm going to make this really quick. So what Christian was just talking about is Scope 1 and 2, think about it, is the emissions directly from your operations as Scope 1. Scope 2 is all of the purchased electricity you need for your operations. And Scope 3 is downstream and upstream, all the basically supply chain. Here's the kicker. Net zero is beyond carbon neutral. I think people often get confused, well, yeah, we're carbon neutral, and that usually means you buy offsets to cover your footprint. Net zero is about your full value chain. So that means Scope 3, which is your supply chain mostly. I mean, there's other categories in there. But the kicker is it's huge. It often dwarfs companies' Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So I don't know, you are closer to the data, but it's often companies will find, oh my gosh, when you do the analysis, it ends up being about 80% of your footprint. For us at VMware, it's about 60. So you suddenly realize from a strategy perspective, yeah, I can procure renewable energy, and Vipul and his team have been great partners for me over the year, doing procurement contracts for energy. But the game has changed now, because it is really about understanding the embedded carbon in your supply chain. And that's a big data challenge. It is a big expertise challenge. And it's complicated, right? Supply chain people, you all know, it's complicated.
So you mentioned regulation. We think maybe pending SEC rules in the US. We think maybe even more significantly CSRD rules in Europe. What's the role of Scope 3 in those regulations?
Yeah, again, maybe just a quick 101 for folks. So the SEC has established, they've gone through a process to look at regulating regulating the disclosures of emissions. And again, to create this level playing field. And the biggest sticking point is Scope 3. So we don't know yet whether or not Scope 3 will be included in the ruling, which has been pushed out. But we suspect eventually it will come. Whether it comes in this first iteration is, still to be determined. But I think the point is that it's coming. The other regulation you mentioned is CSRD, which stands for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which will go into effect in January in the EU. Now, what's important about CSRD is I think of it much like the Brussels effect that happened post GDPR, right? And so while this is designed and intended for the European jurisdiction, again, all of our supply chains, right? Many of us global companies have operations in the EU, which means that we're going to have to understand it, and we're going to be on the hook for these disclosures. And the CSRD is beyond the scope of the SEC because it's not just about climate. Of course, climate is a huge component of it. So at this point in time, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty, but the signs are on the horizon and they're getting closer. And that means companies that are progressive and forward-thinking are preparing now. And partnering with your supply chain team is going to be critical to that.
So these potential Scope 3 rules, I think, are extraordinarily ambitious in terms of what they ask a company to have data on, right? It would be a company who provides compute services to its customers, are tracing back through the data centers to the raw materials, the cement, the steel that goes into them, to the energy of producing those raw materials, and to the carbon emissions associated with that energy. So it's an extraordinarily demanding thing that's being asked of these large companies to say, what are those life cycle emissions associated with your product, all the way back to the cement, to the steel, to the underlying mining. Okay. VMware has prioritized the supply chain work even in advance of what regulation have asked. Like, this is that, like, last year on the leaderboard for supplier engagement on climate. How have you been doing that? How have you been approaching it?
Yeah, great question. Well, it goes back to I think the culture I talked about, but it also goes back, and then maybe I'll just share a story. Should I share the story?
I love the story.
Okay.
Let's do the story.
Okay, I'll tell the story. So in 2020, as I described, we set out this vision for VMware, our 2030 agenda, which is about driving outcomes of sustainability, equity, and trust, and baking that into our multi-cloud strategy. So we set these intentions, and as I described, a lot happened in 2020, and one of my favorite climate speakers is a woman by the name of Catherine Hayhoe. If you're interested in learning about how to talk about climate, take a note of her name and watch her TED Talk. It's excellent, and it's very, very powerful. And in essence, what she says is the most important thing that you can do around climate change is talk about it. So I share that because in the summer of 2020, it was just after the George Floyd murder, and we had a series of listening sessions within the company, and it was after one of those listening sessions that a manager in the supply in Vipple's organization in procurement volunteered to facilitate a conversation around how their function could do more to support the company's values and the ESG goals, the 2030 agenda. And serendipitously, that very same day, I sent Vipul an email asking to talk to him because I needed to partner with him to accelerate our progress. So those two things came together, and initially this manager, Matt, he took it upon himself and to put together a learning session, and that led to a suggestion for a pilot program, which Vipul and his team supported. And from there, we realized the scale of the challenge and the importance of data and systems. So that really, I think, gets to your point, which is there's a whole lot you can do to get started. But where this is going is really about scale, and what we see and what we've experienced at VMware is the power of partnering with the business to integrate these things into enterprise scale platforms and systems. So the data systems and controls behind this is the next wave of what we're doing. So I guess it's a long way of telling the story, which is it came from permission to have conversations. It came from support from management and leadership to encourage people with passion in the supply chain organization to get fluent, to learn about sustainability, learn about climate and decarbonization, and put together a plan. So, it's not this huge, it doesn't have to have, this big, huge, what's the word I want? Grand plan, but it can very much be nurtured from the grassroots up, but aligned with the long-term goals.
And those long-term goals, so that this work Matt is leading, is to say not only is VMware going to engage all of its suppliers, but it's going to get the vast majority of them by spend to commit themselves to science-based targets, kind of recursing down the supply chain, kind of pushing the climate imperative from VMware's leadership down through to the suppliers. What would be your dream scenario for where that work might end up? Like if we're back on this stage with this group in 2030, talking about what we've done in the intervening time, like what's the end goal for this VMware work?
Well, there's the end goal for VMware work, but there's the real end goal, which is for all of you in the room. If we were back here in 2030, this session wouldn't be called the Climate Supply Chain Conference. It would be on main stage, and you all would have experts on your team. You'd all be fluent in supply chain decarbonization, and not just because maybe you care about the planet, but because it makes business sense. Because this is really about, and to use one of the phrases from our previous speaker, this is the next evolution of business and supply chain. So it's going to be a combination. We're not going to get there without digitization and the AI ML and the capabilities for us to get deep intelligence and insight into our supply chain, and carbon will just be another factor along with cost, right? And maybe even more important, because there is no way from a planetary perspective, we're going to achieve the goals of, to meet the Paris Agreement without companies addressing their supply chains. And the other magic I hope that happens by 2030 is we'll realize so much more connectivity and smarter ways of operating our supply chains. Because I think one of the big misnomers about sustainability, that it's about doing less or no growth, and that's completely wrong. Sustainability is about growth. It's about, what we have to do is decouple carbon from that growth. So you all are key to making that vision real.
I love it. And as we come sort of towards time, I think we're probably in our last 5-ish minutes. What's the guidance to the group? We talk with, probably at this point in our outbound sales effort, I would say most of the Fortune 100 companies. Every company above a certain size is wrestling with a similar set of challenges right now about how to prioritize this work, how to build the expertise internally to run it, how to partner externally across software consultants, that complex landscape. And it's really, I think, an expertise shortage right now in this landscape. Your story on Matt is representative of a champion in the business, realizing that they want to prioritize it, realize that there's nobody that necessarily knows more about it than they do, and that they can figure it out. But what's your guidance to leaders in large companies where the supply chain emissions are massive about how to embark on the work?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear actually what the companies you're talking about have to say about that. But to answer from VMware's perspective, I think don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good is a classic guiding principle, right? You got to start somewhere. And that's probably the most important thing, is to start somewhere and have conversations. Again, for Monday morning, if this is the first time you're hearing about it, go look up your company's sustainability team or ESG team. Go have a conversation with someone like me, because they will be delighted to talk to you. So that's one. Number two is there's so much rich support and learning that is not expensive to do. So in our case, right, we had a very passionate champion, but the company supported him to take a certificate, to get some basic 101. But really, it's maybe this is the point I want to leave here, is it's not about having the sustainability expertise. It's building a fluency so that you can partner with folks who do have the expertise. But it really has to be led by the business, by you all, to make the kind of scale and enterprise-wide impact. So I would just say, get started, have a conversation, come talk to me, talk to Christian.
I mean, you asked people, we're seeing the big shift, I think, in these past few years has been there's been so much underlying technology progress in clean technology that makes it possible for countries, businesses, to actually accelerate growth through decarbonization. And that was not the case 20 years ago. There felt like there was this tension of how you prioritize the long-term threat of carbon and climate change, or do you prioritize near-term growth goals? And they've become compatible in a way that makes making the business case so, I think, accessible, and it's pulling a lot of companies faster into this kind of flywheel of ambition, demanding more of their suppliers. Let me ask, as you've been doing this work in VMware in this sort of 5 years of a ton of change, climate change is a weighty topic. Do you feel more optimistic or less optimistic than you did a few years ago about where we're headed as a planet and as an economy on climate?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. Ooh, to be honest, Christian, I think doing my life's work has been in this space. So the truth is, it goes up and down.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So there are days when I feel very hopeful, and there are days when I read, for example, the latest IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. That's sobering. But I will say that I fundamentally believe in the power of human ingenuity, and I think that's why, and unlocking ingenuity in all of its dimensions is what's going to get us through. I fundamentally have faith in humanity that we will figure this out. The combination of creativity and technology is the pathway. I'll just give you a little example, like a human example of how I see, at scale, these conversations happening. So as we looked at our supply, as our spend, so I didn't mention our goal specifically is that 75% of our top suppliers will set their own science-based targets by 2025, so it's super ambitious, hence why Vipul and Matt and Angela and the team we're partnering so tightly on this. But you can't do everything at once, so prioritizing. But then there are these opportunistic things that come up. So when we were looking at the data just a couple of weeks ago, we were doing our reporting, we, like many companies, need to ship things around the world. So we have a big supplier. I won't name the name, but it begins with, you all know who it is, begins with an F. We're using, and this may be getting too technical for the end of a conversation, but the bottom line is that I realized I have a relationship with the head of sustainability over at that company. I called my friend. I'm like, hey, I heard you guys are doing a calculator because we're just using spend data as a methodology to calculate the carbon footprint. And he's like, yeah, we've got this new calculator so we can give you accurate data on your actual shipping. And that was fantastic because now we're getting real data, which reduces makes it much more easy to manage. And I think those kinds of things, supported by technology and the kinds of platforms that are available today and in the future, are what has to fall into that flywheel for us to get to the kind of positive outcome. So yeah,
guarded optimism.
Guarded optimism is a good word, yes. But I think being realistic and understanding the boundaries, is it Louis Pasteur who said that deadlines focus the mind? Yeah. We've got a big planetary deadline, so let's all get focused and do what we can.
All right. Thank you, Nicola.